right, ready for this? We're diving deep into the Indian Constitution today.
Sounds good.
Tons of research from you on this one, huh? Seems like you're really interested in how this massive document impacts both UPSC aspirants and just the everyday person in India.
Absolutely.
So I guess no pressure or anything, but we got to make this insightful A&D engaging.
Challenge accepted, I think. The Indian Constitution really is fascinating, so intricate and impactful, and surprisingly relevant to everyone, even if you're not, prepping for those big exams.
Yeah. Well, let's just get right into it. I mean, first things first, it's huge EE.
It is.
The longest written constitution in the world, isn't it? Why so long? What's with all the
it's
legal jargon?
It's long for a reason, I think. Imagine you're trying to write like a rule book for a country as diverse and complex as India is, all the different languages, the cultures, religions, regional needs. It's a massive undertaking to try to wrangle all of that.
So it's not just about the length, it's about capturing this incredible tapestry of India.
That's a great way to
single document.
Put it. It governs the central government and the individual states, too.
Wow.
Except for Jammu and Kashmir. They have their own constitution, at least until 2019.
Oh, right.
So it's got to lay the groundwork for, a complex federal system.
Makes sense when you put it like that. Okay, so speaking of groundwork, where did they even begin? I mean, did they just come up with all this from scratch?
Not quite. They definitely drew inspiration from a variety of sources, kind of like a global best-of compilation of governmental ideas.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, the influence of the U.S. Constitution is pretty clear, especially when you look at the concept of fundamental rights in India.
Right.
But then the parliamentary structure leans heavily on the British system.
Okay. But it's not.
But it's important to remember that.
Just a copy-paste job, is it?
Definitely not. They really adapted these ideas to fit the unique context of India,
So a blend of global inspiration, but also homegrown innovation. That's actually really cool.
Yeah.
But, constitutions are often seen as rigid, set in stone kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Can the Indian Constitution be changed at all? Or is it fixed forever?
It's actually a really clever balance between rigidity and flexibility.
Oh, interesting.
Some parts are deeply entrenched, and they require, a supermajority in the parliament if you want to even try to amend them. Think of those as like the load-bearing walls of the structure. They're the core principles that are very difficult to change.
Like the fundamental values of Indian democracy.
Exactly. You don't want to mess with those too easily.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But what about the flexible parts? What are those like?
Well, there are other parts that can be amended a bit more easily. This allows the Constitution to adapt, with changing times and all of that.
Yeah.
Think of it like the rooms in a house. You can renovate and redesign them, but the foundation, the structure, stays intact.
Okay, so it's a living document capable of evolving with a nation. I like that.
Yeah.
But India is massive.
It is.
With so many different states and people.
Right.
How does the Constitution handle that? Is it a federal system like they have in the United States?
It's not quite that simple. While India is federation, meaning power is shared between the central government and the states, it's not as clear-cut as in the U.S. It's actually often described as quasi-federal.
Quasi.
Or sometimes cooperative federalism.
Those terms sound a bit technical. Can you break those down a bit for us?
Sure. Essentially, it means that while states do have their own powers and responsibilities, the central government still plays a pretty significant role. Imagine it like a family, maybe. Each member has their own space and freedom, but they still cooperate and work together for, the good of the whole family.
So there's this balance between autonomy for the states, but also the central authority still has its place. How does that actually work out in practice, though?
Well, the Constitution outlines how those powers are supposed to be distributed, but there are mechanisms for the central government to, step in certain situations.
And what kinds of situations?
Well, during a national emergency, for example, the central government can take more control. And there are some areas like defense and foreign affairs that are mainly handled by the central government anyway.
Okay, so it's not just a clean, 50-50 split. There's a lot of nuance and interplay going on.
There is. And understanding those nuances is really important, especially for anyone who wants to serve in the Indian civil services. The UPSC exams often test your knowledge on those fine details.
UPSC aspirants, listen up. All right, so we've got this complex federal system, but how's the government actually run day to day? who's making the decisions?
Well, that's where the parliamentary system comes in. India, like the UK, has a prime minister and a cabinet that are accountable to the parliament.
So it's kind of similar to that British model, but are there any key differences?
Yeah, there are some. While it does draw a lot from the British model, there are some crucial distinctions. For one, the Indian parliament, unlike its British counterpart, isn't totally sovereign. It actually operates within, the framework of the Constitution. And any laws it passes can actually be reviewed by the judiciary.
So there are checks and balances in place.
Exactly. And unlike the UK, where they have that hereditary monarch, India has a president, an elected president, as head of state.
Okay, different players.
Different players, different power dynamics.
Different power dynamics. Okay, got it. What about the courts? I mean, can the Supreme Court overrule Parliament?
That gets at the core of judicial review.
Okay.
Which is, it's really a cornerstone of the Indian Constitution. The Supreme Court can actually declare laws passed by Parliament unconstitutional if they violate the basic principles of the Constitution.
So the judiciary acts as a sort of guardian of the Constitution. But what if the Parliament disagrees with the court's decision? Can they do anything about it?
Of course. The Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution. They could potentially override the court's interpretation. But as we discussed, amending the Constitution is not an easy process at all. It requires those special majorities. It has to be a really significant and deliberate action.
Sounds like a delicate dance between these two branches of government.
That's a good way to put it. It's this dynamic interplay between the judiciary and the legislature. Each one has significant power, but it all operates within that framework of the Constitution.
Right, to make sure that no one entity is
exactly, and that the core principles of Indian democracy are being upheld.
Now, I know we've talked about the structure and the balance of powers.
Yeah.
But the Constitution is also about people, right? What does it say about the rights and responsibilities of citizens?
That's a great point. The Indian Constitution doesn't just talk about how the government is structured. It actually outlines the relationship between the state and its citizens. So it lays out things like fundamental rights, directive principles, even fundamental duties, all aimed at, creating a just and equitable society.
Let's break that down a little bit. What exactly are these fundamental rights?
Think of those as the bedrock of individual freedom and equality in India. They guarantee essential freedoms that every Indian citizen is entitled to. So things like the right to equality, the right to freedom of speech and expression, the right to life and personal liberty, freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights. It's all in there.
So these are basic freedoms that the state can't infringe upon. That's pretty powerful stuff. Are they absolute, though? I mean, are there any limits to these rights?
Well, they are enforceable by law.
Okay.
Article 32 even gives citizens the right to go directly to the Supreme Court if their fundamental rights are violated.
Wow.
So they're pretty powerful, but they're not absolute. No, there are some reasonable restrictions in certain cases. So, for instance, freedom of speech doesn't mean you can just say anything you want. Hate speech, inciting violence, those things aren't protected.
That makes sense. Balancing individual freedoms with, social order and keeping things harmonious.
It's all about striking that balance.
Yeah.
And honestly, that balance is constantly being debated and interpreted, both in the courts and in public discourse.
Now, what about these directive principles you mentioned? Are those rules too?
They're a little different. Think of them more as guiding principles for the state to strive for when they're creating, a just and equitable society. So they touch on a bunch of different issues: social security, fair wages, equal pay for equal work, environmental protection.
So they're more
aspirations.
Aspirations, things that the government should be aiming for, But are they enforceable? I mean, can citizens go to court if the state isn't, implementing these principles?
They're not legally enforceable in the same way as fundamental rights, but they hold a lot of moral weight, and they definitely influence policy decisions. Actually, the courts refer to them pretty often when they're interpreting laws or, making decisions on cases.
So even though they're not directly enforceable, they still kind of shape the way laws are made and interpreted.
Exactly. They act as a kind of compass for the state, guiding it toward creating a more just and equitable society.
Yeah.
And that interplay between the fundamental rights and the directive principles is really, really important. They work together to, create a more balanced and progressive society.
Now, we talked about rights. We talked about guiding principles.
Right.
What about these